Virginia collects cannabis-related tax revenue, but here's the part most people don't realize. There is no guarantee that those dollars ever reach the local communities most impacted by cannabis enforcement. The law allows the money to be redirected, delayed, or even absorbed into broader budget categories before it ever touches Norfolk or Hampton Roads. And that unresolved outcome matters more than people think, because we're coming back to it later. What sounds like a simple pipeline, from tax collection to community benefit, is actually fragmented under Virginia law, and the consequences of that fragmentation are still playing out. Here's the counterintuitive legal fact or misconceptions. A common assumption is that cannabis tax revenue in Virginia is earmarked automatically for community reinvestment. It feels logical. It feels promised. But legally, well, it is not structurally guaranteed in the way many residents believe. The statutes reference intent, but intent is not the same as obligation. That distinction is subtle, but it is everything. And that gap between expectation and statutory reality creates confusion, especially at the local level. Let's challenge a belief that most of us hold. Most viewers assume that if cannabis-related taxes are collected, local governments like Norfolk must be receiving a defined share. That belief, it is understandable, but it fails under how Virginia actually allocates public revenue. The state controls distribution timelines, categories, and priorities, and localities are often downstream recipients rather than direct beneficiaries. That belief becomes risky when policy decisions are made based on money that has not yet arrived, or may never arrive at all. Welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so residents, business owners, and communities understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. Now, this video is a legal and policy analysis. It does not promote cannabis use, sales, cultivation, or consumption. We are not discussing how to access cannabis, how to profit from cannabis, or how to participate in the market. We are examining how Virginia law structures cannabis-related tax revenue, how those funds move, or don't, and what that means legally for local governments, including Norfolk and the broader Hampton Roads region. What we will cover is how revenue is collected, how it is allocated under statute, and why the outcome often diverges from public expectation. What we will not cover is speculation, political advocacy, or financial advice. And as we move through this, keep that opening issue in mind, the uncertainty of where the money actually lands, because that's where enforcement, budgeting, and policy collide. Here's the context. Virginia's cannabis tax framework did not emerge in a vacuum. It evolved alongside hemp regulation, medical cannabis expansion, and partial decriminalization. Each legislative session added layers, sometimes without fully reconciling them. So, the revenue structure we have today reflects compromise, caution, and political sequencing rather than a single cohesive design. Cannabis-related revenue is collected through a mix of excise taxes, sales taxes, and fees tied to regulated activity. But unlike traditional sin taxes, such as alcohol, Virginia's cannabis framework was built during a period of regulatory uncertainty. That uncertainty is why so many people misunderstand how the money flows. And confusion thrives where statutes reference future implementation rather than present obligation. Here's the legal explanation. Under Virginia law, cannabis tax revenue is deposited into state-controlled funds before any local allocation occurs. The statutes describe how funds may be distributed, to education, public health, substance abuse treatment, or community reinvestment, but those pathways are subject to budgetary authorization. This is where people often conflate chemistry with policy, or rather, product legality with fiscal certainty. Revenue collection does not equal revenue distribution. The General Assembly retains authority over appropriations, and that authority can override expectations set by earlier legislative language. Let me rephrase that more clearly. The law allows cannabis tax revenue to exist without immediately assigning it to a specific local outcome. That distinction matters when local governments plan programs based on projected funds rather than appropriated funds. Let's look at how enforcement works. Cannabis tax enforcement is handled at the state level through the Department of Taxation, with coordination from regulatory agencies overseeing cannabis and hemp compliance. Investigations begin through audits, reporting discrepancies, or enforcement referrals, not through consumer complaints about where money goes. And here's the key point: lab reports, tax receipts, or licensing fees do not dictate allocation. They only establish collection. Once collected, the money enters a state-controlled process governed by budget cycles and legislative priorities. So even when revenue exists on paper, its destination remains unresolved until appropriated. Who this affects? Consumers are often told their purchases contribute to community benefit, but legally, that benefit is indirect and delayed. Retailers may factor anticipated community reinvestment into compliance narratives, but they do not control where funds go. Local governments, including Norfolk, may plan initiatives expecting future revenue that is not guaranteed. And within the medical cannabis framework, funding expectations often intersect with healthcare access discussions, without statutory certainty tying revenue to outcomes. Each group operates under a different assumption, and those assumptions do not always align. Why this matters? This matters for public safety because underfunded programs create enforcement gaps. It matters for regulatory clarity because ambiguity erodes trust. It matters legally and financially because reliance on non-appropriated funds creates risk. And long-term, it matters for policy integrity, because when expectations repeatedly go unmet, public confidence in governance declines. Now, this is where things shift. Here's a scenario. Earlier, I mentioned that cannabis tax revenue has no guaranteed local destination. Now let's return to that. Imagine Virginia collects significant cannabis-related tax revenue in a fiscal year. Norfolk anticipates funding for community reinvestment programs based on prior legislative language. Plans are drafted. Partnerships are discussed. But during budget negotiations, the General Assembly reallocates those funds to broader state priorities. Legally, that reallocation is permissible. In an alternate scenario, the same revenue is collected, but this time, the appropriation language explicitly directs funds to localities. Norfolk receives a defined share. Programs launch. Outcomes materialize. The difference is not the tax. It's the statutory allocation language. That is where the assumption breaks, and where legal clarity finally emerges. What to watch next? Watch how future General Assembly sessions modify appropriation language. Watch how local governments adjust expectations. And watch how enforcement agencies communicate revenue realities versus political messaging. Or you can check out some of our recent videos on Virginia Beach Cannabis Policy and Legalization Timeline, the Virginia Cannabis Retail Market Update for Norfolk 2026, and another more popular video on how cannabis law in Virginia just changed. Here's a question. If tax revenue exists but allocation is uncertain, what responsibility does the law have to match public expectation with statutory reality? So, the legal takeaway is this: Virginia cannabis tax revenue allocation is a policy process, not an automatic outcome. Understanding that distinction protects communities, governments, and the integrity of the law itself. If this helped clarify the issue, like the video, subscribe for more Virginia-specific cannabis law analysis, and join the discussion through the Norfolk City Cannabis Community, where we break these issues down in full legal context, without hype, and without misinformation.